Fiction and non-fiction. Is the modern distinction between the two a fiction? This question has been addressed throughout the channel for this video, for this recording. But let us focus on it as a central topic. Fiction and non-fiction. The 18th century philosopher Giambattista Vico addressed this problem vis-a-vis the Cartesian revolution, which is retraceable in turn to a Machiavellian revolution. Today we are raised to assume that there is a distinction, we have a formal, substantive even, distinction between fiction and non-fiction. Everywhere we go to the library and we look for fiction. We go to school and they teach us in elementary school, elementary grade. This is fiction. This is non-fiction. Non-fiction is true. Fiction, not so much. It might have some elements of truth, but non-fiction, that's about history, or at least it tries to be true. It tries to be historically correct. What about fiction? It doesn't try to be true. It doesn't try to be historically correct. It distorts history. The modern notion of history is, we're not told in school, but it is strictly modern. What does this mean? Why, the ancients didn't have history? Of course, but not. They had historia. They had stories. Now, these stories were vouched by some author. They were retraceable to an author. They were somebody's story. And so they were not merely myth. They were mythos, or mythoi. They were a subcategory of myth. They were stories that are reliable insofar as they are authored by someone who vouches for them. So we have Thucydides, who has a story. Herodotus has a story. The notion that we can have a story that is altogether non-fictitious or non-poetic is strictly modern. It depends on the modern invention of facts. Again, a fact, factum in Latin, is something that is done. But in the modern sense, a fact is a crude datum, something that belongs to the realm of what René Descartes calls res extensa, quantifiable stuff, material that is out there in the face of a subject. This Cartesian ego is somehow abstracted out of all of this, at least formally, in his awareness, and then responds to the stuff that is out there, devoid of value, because value is attributed by the subject to this objective material or nature in the vulgar sense of the term, in the respect that nature ultimately might involve the whole, which includes both the subject and the object. All right, so facts in the modern context, or in modern discourse, are not what they used to be. What they used to be is simply, I went to the market, Caesar crossed the river. It's a fact. It's something given as something done. It's done. But in the modern sense, it's purged of the element of myth, of superstition, of fiction. So a pure fact is a mechanically purged element, purged of the illusory. So it is a scientific datum. This is crucial. This notion that we can reach facts, or at any rate strive to reach them because they're there, pure, purged of all the imagination, all dreams, right, is at the basis of the distinction between fiction and non-fiction. Now, what about the ancients? Did they not say that there is a true account? Well, sure. And Christianity, of course, emphasizes this. But it is true for the faithful. In other words, relatively to God. So, an account is true in the respect that it is sacred. It is illuminated by the Holy Spirit. What about the modern context? There's no Holy Spirit. So it is true now insofar as it meets the criteria of a scientific method. So it's been purged, demythologized, as it were. Now we get the realm of history, which is the realm of facts. Now, what are these facts? They're evidence. Fact is an evidence, piece of evidence. This evidence is mechanistically structured and arrived at. Once we abstract, take out the element of the imagination from evidence, the element of dreams, we are left with bare facts. These facts can be interpreted, but only a posteriori. In other words, first we get the facts, then we supply the interpretation which comes from without. They're not interpreted in the sense that a meaning of the fact is extrapolated. The meaning. No such thing, because these are just res extensa. It's just stuff, quantifiable material. So, we look at the past in terms of the demands for a reconstruction, a scientific reconstruction. We want to find the true historical material, right? Purged of the illusions, the lies of ancient poets. In classical times, this project would have been considered altogether idiotic. Idiotic in itself, preposterous, intellectually speaking, morally speaking, devious, suicidal. How is that? Well, this project owes a lot to Christianity, which it corrupts. In the early Christian context, we have the denouncing of old stories about the gods, old accounts about life, about human life, because human life involves the gods, of course, the transcendent. Take religion out of human society and you end up with Disneyland. So they had not yet invented that, so obviously it was part of life. And so, the Christians looked at the pagans and they said, well, these pagans had false gods. So their accounts of the human situation was false, faulty. The Christians come up with a sacred story or sacred history, historia sacra, as opposed to the vulgar history. Vulgar history was false. It had to be called false in order to establish that the new one is true. But it's true in mysterious ways, and so it is still quite poetic. It is true not by abstracting itself from all imagination, but by placing the imagination in God. So it is purged of, we could say, deception, evil thoughts. It is purged from the distractions, the element of distraction from the whole point of the history or the story, which is a return to God's own understanding. So, the true story is not at all cut off from the false story, even though the false is sometimes bashed. The Christian story is altogether poetic. It is poetic, however, without having, for instance, gods who are doing nasty things with each other and toward men. So it is a story that helps us understand what is good. In order to help us understand what is good, the true story has to, well, elevate our attention somehow, to some extent, shall we say, blinding us to the murkiness of life. And yet, of course, Christianity takes that murkiness and it represents it in the most vivid way, extreme way. So there is a kind of stylization of good and evil. And this for the sake of establishing a good path that leads to the good, of course. A good type of discourse that responds to the corruption of pagan discourse, the confusion, the chaos of the late Roman Empire. So that new discourse, the new true history, certainly makes sense. However, some, throughout the years, the centuries, will try to purge Christian stories so that they are no longer tainted by the poetic, by the imaginary. So they try to radicalize the division between Christianity and paganism. This is done ultimately, most evidently, by the early moderns. So what they want to do is what Christianity failed to do, namely establish justice here and now in this world, once and for all. Or move in that direction at any rate. How do we do that? Scientifically. So, today's academics are very much indebted to this modern revolution. They're seeking historical reconstructions. Let us consider what their argument might be in defense of facts and so of nonfiction. So we pick up a scholarly work of nonfiction, which pulls out, digs out of the past what is true, historically accurate, and, well, leaves out a lot. Now, Why is this done? Well, it is done so that we can, of course, establish a society of the true, right? A society where we no longer have lies, ideally. Right? So we're moving in that direction, or at least we're opening the door to it. We're dreaming. Ooh, dream. Now, what are we to make of this dream? Let us consider an example. The historical Socrates. We have all kinds of poetic accounts of Socrates. But who was the historical Socrates? Of course, we could say this about all kinds of figures, including Jesus, not to speak of Moses. But let us consider Socrates. Did Socrates really live? What do you mean by really? Well, in history, historically, was there a physical person whose name was Socrates? Is there any physical person? Yes. But what does it mean to be physical? If we consider any man, is he a physical being? Is he a body? Are we our body? Where do we find a man? In his body or in his speech? Or through his speech, in his understanding? In thinking, in thought? Where is man? What are we driving at? What are we looking for? If we find the body, then we'll find the mind, the thought, the speech. Really. If there's a speech, then we say, must have been a body. Right? But the body is not, of course, the reason for the speech. It is not the proof of the speech. It is merely a sign of a speech. Does it matter to find the body? Where is the body? In the Christian Gospels, we have somebody who is very much interested in the body. He says, I want to believe. He says, is that a real wound? The real wound, of course, is a spiritual wound. But he cannot see that because he does not elevate himself out of his physicalist delusion. And so he's invited to stick his finger in the wound, the physical wound, as a proof of a spiritual resurrection, of the resurrection of the flesh in spirit. What are our academics up to? They're looking for the body. Isn't the body a fact? Again, for the classics, the body is a fact. It is something given. It is evidence. But this evidence, which is to say that which is given out to see, that's that which is apparent to us, is a question mark. It is not a res extensa, simply mechanistically framed in a box, in a compartment. There it is, closed issue. It's matter settled. No, it is a problem that is disclosed in a spiritual context, in a poetic context. So there is no assumption that you can have a non-poetic account. All stories are poetic, all of them. And now the distinction is between bad poetry and good poetry. A good account is an account that helps us understand. A bad account is one that distracts us from reality. Reality is essentially spiritual. The body is just a shadow. The body, as in the tangible, empirical certainty, is simply a shadow of a spiritual reality. Incidentally, in Dante's comedy, the first canto of the Inferno, we have the encounter of Dante's avatar with Virgil. And Virgil is responding to a question. He says, Dante says, are you a certain man or an uncertain man? Are you, now the uncertain man is a shadow, poetic shadow. The certain man is the body. The irony here is that the body is now referred to in a poetic context. So it is not all that evident, speaking of evidence, which one is more real, right? The body or the shadow, the ombra, the ghost. The same problem of a ghost reappears in Shakespeare in various plays, including Hamlet, not to speak of Romeo and Juliet. The ghost turns out to be more real than the body, or to be more precise, it exposes the truth about the body. The body is a ghost. Ghost of spiritual reality. When we call facts real, we are deluding ourselves into reducing truth to mere evidence. This evidence is a shadow of truth. And to build a world on that basis of an evidence considered scientifically is to build a castle of Babel, ultimately devoid of truth and filled with the pretense of truth. So that's what virtually all academics are up to today. Universities. But why? They're trained to go in that direction from their infancy. We're told in second grade, third grade, elementary school, perhaps even in first grade. And then earlier than that, indirectly we're told, right, by the way our teachers, our environment functions. We're told that here is fiction, here is nonfiction. Fiction is fun. Religion is about fiction or about some dream of another world. But if you want the truth, go for science. It'll give you the facts. This is the greatest fiction of the modern world. And again, to refer to Giambattista Vico, Giambattista Vico exposes this lie, this fiction, as a bad fiction that not only distracts us from real problems, it confuses us as to the meaning of terms. It seeks what is true as the certain. It seeks to reconcile once and for all the certain and the true. Let us consider these two terms. The true today is considered to be scientific, so far as it is the result of the application of a scientific method to facts, what is certain. What is certain is the evident. And so evidence is given to us, that's certain. The body, bang, a fist is certain. Ouch, it hurts. It's certain. But the question of the true comes up when we're at a remove from the fist. So we hear somebody punch somebody else. There's a fact. A bunch of people were burned in an oven. It's a fact. But now we need to verify it, right? Make it true. To make it true, we have to apply a rigorous scientific method to the facts to extrapolate the element that is to be absolutely certain and true. Here is one problem. The scientific method is assumed to be true, but it is only formally true. It is not substantive. It is a kind of mathematical abstraction that is applied to facts. It is not in itself a fact the way other facts are facts. Disputable, relative, ever-changing. The scientific method is a universal that can be applied everywhere. And Vico will argue that this leads to the tyranny of a method. So, the true, ultimately, is the result of the application of this abstract universal made of symbolic entities, numbers, applied to physical certainties. Extrapolating elements of them and integrating them ultimately in a purely true technical society. Right? Technocracy again. This question I've addressed in several discussions, several lectures, several talks on this channel. So, what does Vico say? Why shouldn't we go for that? First of all, it's a lie. It's a distraction from, again, creates confusion. Confusion leads to violence, chaos, and the need for chaos management. So, new political structure, government understood as chaos management. Ultimately, bada boom, a great explosion. But what is the alternative? Should we just accept dreams? Of course not. Modern scholarship has blinded us to the distinction between poetic fiction and poetic understanding. The poet understands something that he then explains. But the explanation is not supposed to resolve the understanding within itself. It's supposed to invite us to rise to the level of the poet's understanding. But in our day, we're brought up to assume that the whole point is to reduce everything to the account, the facts. And again, you apply the method, and then you find the pure account, pure historical record, or the pure historical fact, rather. Right? The real Socrates is the historical Socrates. For the classics, this is all baloney. And it is abominable, in fact. It's devious. It distracts us from the whole point of the human being, which is to rise to a truth beyond shadows. Now, this is ultimately what is at stake here. Is there a way out of the cave, out of Plato's cave? What is truth? Well, in medieval terms, it is the coincidence, the conjoining, or the harmony between the thing and understanding. That means that the thing is purely intelligible, it's an idea. Which is to say, ultimately, that it is, again, in medieval discourse, it is in mind, in the mind of God. Are we to seek a true without the certain? Or a certain without the true? A certain without the true is a barbaric body. The true without the certain is mathematics, purely abstract, symbolic, doesn't hurt anybody. And so the modern tries to put the two together by applying the mathematics to the physical. This is done for the first time in a rigorous way because the mathematical is cut off from the divine, which it had always referred to. So mathematics was purely theoretical in goal and aspiration. It was the merchants in old societies that picked up the dregs of mathematics, as it were, and tried to do something with them. We also have, of course, mathematics applied to ordinary circumstances of life, architecture, most notably. But the whole point of mathematics was that it served, ultimately, divination. It was tied to the gods. It was tied to mysterious truth. Mathematics was rooted in the divine. Suffice it to recall Pythagoras. So, what are we to do? Are we to try to establish a scientific society? Or are we to go with the classics? The option, of course, is thrown out there as not suggesting that we're going to change the world today. We're all set. We live in a modern world. It's going to run its course. It's running its course. There's nothing you or I can do to change that. However, when you're in Sodom, what do? Do you somehow leave Sodom? In what respect can you leave Sodom? Do you turn your back to it, or do you just jump on the bandwagon, embrace the rhetoric, jump with everyone else, be enthralled, be progressive, trying not to be left behind, run the rat race, and so forth? Or is there an alternative, as opposed to, of course, you could dream on the weekend, whenever you're not serving the master. You can also become a terrorist, but that simply all feeds back into the Leviathan. So, in the element of reflection, we can rise out of this bubble that we're raised in. So let us consider this. The true and the certain. As long as we limit the human condition to these two elements, abstracted from one another, and then we try to put them back together as Humpty Dumpty, we're doomed. But as soon as we recognize that there is a true in the certain, prior to the true being abstracted, symbolically, mathematically, out of it, things change. We begin seeing things that we had not noticed before. If the world is not simply res extensa to begin with, if we're not looking for the bare historical facts, what are we looking for? The true within the certain Giambattista Vico speaks of the true as the certain illuminated by natural reason. Natural reason is, of course, presence of, say, divine intellect in everything, in man, most notably. So, the question here is to illuminate, one of illuminating the certain, so that the certain now is recognized as a poetic fiction that reflects being poetic, a divine understanding, a divine mind. So the whole point of scholarship should be precisely this. Not to verify in a Cartesian modern scientific way, for the sake of integration of facts in a scientific, technocratic, ultimately, society, but the illumination of things, of facts, of evidence, in its proper poetic context. When we today look at the history of Christianity, for instance, and we say, well, we have a scientific one. In the earlier ages, they did not have a scientific one. They still remained within the swamp of dreams of the imagination. We're fooling ourselves. The classics understood quite well, including the medievals, of course, understood quite well that there is a distinction between what is said and what you understand. The whole point was to strive to speak in such a way that could be helpful to the understanding. In various ways helpful. Helpful because it helps organize a society in such a way, a regime, in such a way that is helpful for the young to grow in a spiritually healthy way, right? Without being spiritually crippled. So, there we have the question. The task of the scientist, in classical terms, is that of illuminating the true nature of the physical. The physical is essentially poetic in the respect that it serves as a mirror of the understanding. It's the political valence of classical scholarship. Classical scholarship presents the human situation as a mirror, as a stage that reflects, right, the understanding. It's open to the understanding. It invites also the understanding. Meaning, value is sought within that mirror, not as something applied from without or ex machina to that mirror. In other words, the mirror is not simply an opaque form, right, that reflects itself, that feeds back into itself. Hence the general orientation of life in pre-modern societies. It's an otherworldly orientation. The non-progressive orientation of those societies depends on their focus on an understanding that transcends the physical as such. The brute, the savage, the barbaric. What we have today is this war of facts, right? Where I have my fact, you have your fact, and then we have to fight against each other for the sake of establishing the true facts, which ultimately are established by the computer, by the machine society. So we all fight against each other for facts, mistaking them for truth, my fact, your fact, And then they have all these facts have to be verified, vetted by the machine, the great fat checker, the fat checker. So this big fat checker or fact checker is the regime we all live under, and that defines the rules of the game. We all submit to it as an unspoken, unnamed God. Right. So here is the drama of our times. We're not raised to think about these problems because we're trapped in the circus of fact wars, information wars, that ultimately is signing our death sentence collectively. In our global Sodom, what are we to do? Reflect. Raise questions. Think about those questions. Focusing on the single principle that you trust that the problems can be understood and that we are endowed with an inalienable capacity to understand them.